Well, I remember when your book, Londonistan, came out, and that's a few years ago. It's over a decade ago that it came out. I remember it very well. And when it came out, there was no Arab Spring. Hadn't happened yet. There was no war in Syria. Hadn't happened yet. The mass migration to Europe, that's of the last 3-4 years, hadn't happened yet. But you obviously had a significant Muslim population in London because you were talking about back then when you wrote this book, an Islamic State, before there was an Islamic State.
Well, what was worrying me at the time, and this was in the wake of 9/11, obviously,
Yeah.
when I think virtually all of us kind of woke up to the
Right.
fact there was such a threat. What then became apparent to me over the following few years was that the British political and intellectual establishment was not only not dealing with this threat, but wasn't prepared even to identify it as the threat that it was, based in what I consider to be a form of religious fanaticism, a particular interpretation of Islam, which had taken hold in the Islamic world and was backed by the most powerful forces in the Islamic world, and which was setting out to Islamize the non-Islamic world and to Islamize also, or to re-Islamize, the Islamic world that wasn't considered Islamic enough. And what concerned me was the way in which Britain was making itself a haven for the most extreme voices in this
Way
world.
back then.
Way back then.
Yeah, before all this immigration issue even began. I mean, the serious immigration crisis.
Yes, well, Britain had an immigration of people mainly from Pakistan, Bangladesh, who were Muslim. And those people who came into Britain were fine. They were people who came for work. They came typically from poor villages
Sure.
in Pakistan and Bangladesh. They weren't particularly pious. They weren't particularly religious. They simply wanted a job and a peaceful life. What we didn't realize, what Britain didn't realize at the time, was that they brought with them religious institutions which had been radicalized in Pakistan and Bangladesh. They had been radicalized by the Saudi-based Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, which is the interpretation of Islam which is jihadi Islam. It's militant, it's aggressive, it believes in Islamizing the people who are not Islamic enough or not Islamic at all, and they're the people who cause us the most problems today. And they brought with them, the immigrants to Britain brought with them the institutions that had been radicalized by this Wahhabi version of Islam. And as a result, the children who were born in Britain became more radical than their parents, because the children went to the mosques and the madrasas, which were staffed by people who were radicalized in this way, education institutions. And even though the vast majority of these children were educated in British mainstream schools, nevertheless, the influence was a radical one from the religious point of view.
Wahhabism, as we know, they were the 9/11 pilots. They were the people who engineered the attack. And that's something that can't be stressed or forgotten, I believe, enough. We need to remember that. Did you find in the beginning, when you were speaking out about this, you must have felt like you were all alone in some cases? You were the only one that was warning anyone there. And we felt the same way here as we began to warn about Islam. People looked at us funny, like, it can't really be that bad. It can't all be like this. Is that what happened to you? And did the media kind of drive this at the same time to make you look like that this was, you were more fanatic than maybe you even felt you were?
Very much so. I was considered to be absolutely on the extreme edge of discourse, that I was being alarmist for no good reason, that I was demonizing an entire population. And this was despite the fact that I actually have always, in everything I've ever written and said about this Islamic problem, I've always emphasized that we cannot generalize, that there are many millions of Muslims who do not subscribe to this particularly extreme interpretation of Islam. Many of them came to Britain because they were fleeing from it. They wanted to live under Western human rights. They wanted to live in peace and security and raise their children, have good jobs, and just have a nice life. And the majority of people even today who are the victims of this terrible Islamic extremism are in fact Muslims. But at the same time, what we've been through, and what we're still living through, is a situation in which our political leaders in Britain and America and in mainland Europe and elsewhere, just deny that this thing has anything to do with Islam. I mean, in my view, this is an interpretation of Islam. It's a particular interpretation. It's not subscribed to by everybody, but it is rooted in the theology. It has theological sources. And it's ridiculous to say it's got nothing to do with Islam. And our leaders deny this. And, if you can't even name properly the thing you're up against, if you can't accept and acknowledge that what you're up against is religious fanaticism, which is a different order of magnitude completely, a different type of threat from any other threat, when people believe they're motivated by the defense of God, which is what they believe they are, then if you don't understand that, you cannot possibly deal with it properly.
You're listening to Understanding the Times Radio. I'm Jan Markell. I have in studio with me Melanie Phillips. I'm going to give you the rundown of what her credits are again a little bit later. Again, I got familiar with her over a decade ago, Londonistan. when that came out, about 2006. Eric Barger in studio with me. We're talking to her about, well, quite frankly, it's sort of a subtitle of the book, Londonistan. It's really a warning to America about all who care about freedom. And obviously, Melanie, Europe is going through some trials. Now, what I read in your book, what I read online, in Britain, God is pretty much dead. Now, God didn't die, but Great Britain and other parts of Europe have thrown him out. And they've replaced him with superstition, replaced him with government, replaced him with multiculturalism, replaced him with diversity. And I even read where some are, instead of God, they're turning to witchcraft, they're turning to psychic activity, they're turning to astrology. In other words, anything but God. Churches are being turned into mosques. I mean, this is a serious warning to the Western world, to our part of the world, United States and Canada. Serious warning.
Well, I think you put your finger on it, and indeed I developed these precise themes in my subsequent book, which was published 4 years after Londonistan, called The World Turned Upside Down, The Global Battle Over God, Truth and Power. And what I say in that book is that two things have happened in the West which feed into each other. One is the systematic erosion of Western national identity and the Western values, which are based on the Hebrew Bible and Christianity. And they have been replaced by a whole lot of secular ideologies or isms, moral and cultural relativism, multiculturalism, and all kinds of other ideologies. These ideologies, if you drill them down, they all have a common core, which is the despising of and the desire to undermine and overturn the core values of Western society, which are based on the Hebrew Bible and on Christianity. And these ideologies brook no dissent because they drive all before it, because they are ideologies where the power of the idea drives all before it. It cannot be gainsaid. It cannot be challenged. And the reason it can't be challenged is because it's not just an idea. It's not just a point of view. It's a point of view that is considered to stand proxy for virtue itself. If you believe in multiculturalism, for example, you are motivated by the desire to make a better world based on the erosion of bigotry. Bigotry only comes from people being divided, so you avoid division by saying that no culture can consider itself to be superior to any other. And that way you basically get rid of bigotry from the human heart. Who could possibly disagree with that? Well, I would disagree with that because I personally think the West's values, based on biblical morality, are better than anyone else's values. But if I say that under the doctrine of multiculturalism, I'm a bigot and a racist and a phobe and all the rest of it. So these ideologies can't be gainsaid. You cannot argue against them. And as a result, not only are they destructive of the basis of our Western society in and of themselves, but they bring about inexorably a situation where they stamp out dissent. They are innately totalitarian. They cannot brook any dissent. So if people dissent from these ideologies, they can't be permitted to have an alternative point of view. They have to be basically run out of the public square altogether. So in order to do that, anybody who stands up against moral relativism or multiculturalism or whatever it is, they have labels put round their neck. Phobe, bigot, xenophobe, racist, white supremacist, fascist, Nazi, all of those labels. Those labels act as a kind of warning to everybody else. Don't go there. Don't listen to this person because this person is a really bad person, and if, heaven forbid, this person's view should ever gain traction, then the world will become a terrible place.